What if the story you've heard about the Titanic isn't the full story? What if the most famous shipwreck in history wasn't just a tragic accident in the North Atlantic, but part of a hidden financial scheme? For more than 100 years, one theory has refused to die. It claims the ship that struck the iceberg on the night of April 14, 1912, wasn't really the Titanic at all. It was her damaged sister ship, the Olympic, swapped in secret, sent to sea under a false name, then deliberately sacrificed so the owners could collect the insurance money. It sounds like the plot of a movie, a doomed ocean liner, a corporate cover-up, a switch so massive it fooled the world. But is any of it true? Or is the real story of Titanic even darker than the conspiracy? Because when you strip away the myth, what you find is not a master plan, but something far more disturbing. A chain of warnings ignored, fatal decisions made in plain sight, and a disaster that may have been preventable from the start. Insurance scam or historical myth? The truth behind Titanic. The Titanic is one of those rare events that feels frozen in time. A ship called unsinkable, a collision in the dark, more than 1,500 dead, and a tragedy so huge that people have spent generations trying to explain it in a way that feels bigger than an iceberg. That's where the conspiracy begins. According to the theory, Titanic's sister ship, the RMS Olympic, had been badly damaged before Titanic's maiden voyage. White Star Line, the company that owned both ships, supposedly faced a financial disaster. So the theory says they did the unthinkable. They secretly switched Olympic and Titanic. Then they sent the damaged ship to sea under Titanic's name, expecting it to be lost, the passengers to be rescued, and the insurance payout to save the company. It's dramatic. It's sinister. And at first glance, it even sounds possible. The two ships really did look very similar. Olympic really was damaged in 1911, and White Star Line really did face enormous pressure after the sinking. So why do historians and official investigations reject the theory? Because once you stop looking at the story like a thriller and start looking at the evidence, the conspiracy starts collapsing almost immediately. History.com blog.pia.org. The conspiracy theory explained clearly. Let's break down exactly what believers claim happened. In September 1911, Olympic was involved in a collision with the British warship HMS Hawke. The damage was serious, especially on the starboard side. Repairs were made, but conspiracy theorists argue the ship was never truly profitable after that, or that the damage was worse than the public knew. Now enter Titanic. She was still new, bigger, more luxurious, not yet tied to public memory. According to the theory, White Star Line saw an opportunity. If they couldn't recover the losses from Olympic, they could allegedly disguise Olympic as Titanic, send her out on the maiden voyage, arrange a controlled accident, evacuate the passengers, and collect the insurance. In this version of events, the real Titanic would continue operating under the name Olympic, while the damaged Olympic would go down in history as Titanic. It's the kind of story built to spread. It has everything people want from a conspiracy: money, power, betrayal, and the feeling that ordinary history is hiding an extraordinary secret. And that's exactly why it survives. Not because the evidence is strong, but because the narrative is unforgettable. There's something emotionally satisfying about believing the biggest disasters must have hidden architects behind them. That randomness feels too small. Human failure feels too ordinary. People want a villain. But history doesn't always give us one. Sometimes what destroys people isn't genius-level evil. Sometimes it's overconfidence, neglect, and systems that fail at the exact moment they're needed most. The first major problem: the money doesn't work. The biggest weakness in the insurance conspiracy is also the simplest one. If White Star Line really planned this as an insurance fraud, it should have made financial sense. But according to the evidence, it didn't. One historical summary of the conspiracy points out that Titanic was worth around $7.5 million in 1912 money, but insured for only $5 million. In other words, Titanic was underinsured. That matters because the whole theory depends on the idea that sinking the ship would rescue White Star Line financially. But if the payout didn't even cover the ship's full value, then the supposed scam becomes a terrible scam. History.com also highlights this exact point, noting that one of the strongest arguments against the switch theory is that the insurance on Titanic was not enough to cover the alleged loss of Olympic. In other words, the conspiracy fails on its own financial logic. History.com. Think about that. You would need a massive covert operation involving shipyard workers, officers, insurers, management, and probably dozens, if not hundreds of people keeping quiet forever. You would need to risk international scandal. You would need to stage the sinking of a passenger liner carrying more than 2,000 people. And after all that, the money still wouldn't fully solve the problem. That is not how corporate fraud usually works. Fraud happens when the reward is worth the risk. Here, the risk is civilization ending for the company, and the reward is still too small. That doesn't make the theory impossible in some abstract sense, but it makes it irrational. And irrational conspiracies involving huge numbers of people tend not to survive contact with reality. The second problem: the human logistics are absurd. Even if you ignore the money, the logistics are almost impossible. Titanic and Olympic may have looked alike from a distance, but they were not magic duplicates that could be swapped without consequence. To carry out the conspiracy, White Star Line would have had to alter and disguise one of the most famous engineering projects in the world, without workers talking, without inspectors noticing, and without a paper trail that exposed everything later. And then there's an even more brutal question. If the plan was to sink the ship in a controlled way and rescue everyone, how exactly was that supposed to happen? Titanic carried only 20 lifeboats, enough for around 1,200 people, while roughly 2,200 people were aboard. That fact alone creates a devastating problem for the theory. blog.pia.org. A staged sinking depends on control, but there was no control. No lifeboat capacity for everyone. No guarantee another ship would arrive immediately. No safe margin if panic broke out. And no realistic explanation for why a company trying to fake a disaster would create a scenario where mass death was almost guaranteed. That point is often overlooked because conspiracies live on broad strokes. They survive on mood, not mechanics. But mechanics matter. Real-world operations fail when tiny details are wrong, and here, the tiny details are catastrophic. Because this wasn't just one or two missing lifeboats. It was a gap so large that even the fantasy version of the plot starts to collapse under its own weight. 656 to 715. Mid-video CTR, retention boost. But here's where the story takes a turn. Because even if the insurance conspiracy falls apart, that does not mean Titanic's sinking was just bad luck. The real evidence points to something else, something less sensational than a secret ship swap, but far more chilling. The conspiracy may be false, but the negligence was real. 716 to 915. What official history says actually happened. According to Britannica, Titanic sank because of a collision with an iceberg that damaged at least 5 watertight compartments. The ship was designed to stay afloat if as many as 4 compartments were breached, but 5 was too many. Once water began spilling from one compartment into the next, the ship's fate was effectively sealed. And that already makes the real story more complex than the old movie version.
For years, many people imagined the iceberg tore a giant hole down the side of the ship. But later examination of the wreck suggested something more subtle and more dangerous, a series of thinner openings, brittle fracturing, and structural failures around the hull plates and seams that allowed water to flood in. Britannica notes that later studies and builder records also led to speculation that low-quality steel or weak rivets may have contributed to the scale of the disaster. That means Titanic wasn't destroyed by a single cinematic slash. It was undone by design limits, material weaknesses, and a damage pattern the ship could not survive. Then came the human side. The official U.S. Senate inquiry into the sinking criticized high speed in an ice region, failures to heed wireless warnings, inadequate lifeboat regulations, and the failure of nearby assistance to arrive in time. It did not support any insurance conspiracy. Instead, it pointed to negligence and systemic safety failures. U.S. Senate report. So when people ask what really happened to Titanic, the official answer is not hidden sabotage. It is a deadly combination of nature, engineering limits, and human decisions that made a bad situation irreversible. And in some ways, that's a harder truth to accept, because conspiracy gives us intention. Negligence gives us responsibility. Warnings were there. One reason the conspiracy theory persists is because people feel that something this large must have had warning signs. And they're right. It did. The terrible truth is not that Titanic was secretly switched. It's that danger was visible, and the system still failed. The Senate inquiry was sharply critical of the way the disaster unfolded. It concluded that the ship had been traveling too fast in an area known for ice, that warnings had not been treated with enough urgency, and that existing lifeboat regulations were outdated and inadequate for a ship of Titanic's size. It also criticized the captain of the Californian for failing to come to Titanic's aid. U.S. Senate report. That is the part people should sit with, not the fantasy of a secret switch, but the reality that modern systems often fail in boring, familiar ways. Signals are missed. Rules lag behind technology. People trust procedures that are no longer good enough. Experts assume the worst-case scenario won't happen to them. And then, one night, it does. The Titanic disaster is terrifying not because it proves someone staged history. It's terrifying because it shows how prestige can become blindness. The ship was celebrated as a masterpiece, a symbol of progress, a monument to confidence. And yet, confidence is exactly what made the danger easier to dismiss. That's why the real Titanic story still matters, because it's not just about 1912. It's about every system that believes scale equals safety. Every institution that mistakes reputation for resilience, and every decision-maker who hears a warning and assumes there's still time. Why the conspiracy survives anyway. So if the evidence is this weak, why does the insurance theory still spread? Because conspiracies don't live or die on evidence alone. They live on emotion. And Titanic is emotionally perfect for conspiracy. It sits at the intersection of luxury, death, technology, class, and myth. The ship itself was already larger than life. Once it sank, it became more than a disaster. It became a symbol. And symbols attract alternative explanations. People also get pulled in by visual similarity. Titanic and Olympic did resemble each other. To someone encountering the theory for the first time, that can feel like proof. Add in the earlier Olympic collision, and suddenly coincidence starts looking like motive. But similarity is not identity. Suspicion is not evidence, and a compelling story is not the same thing as a documented one. History.com treats the insurance fraud and Olympic switch claim as one of the most popular Titanic conspiracies, but also points out that it breaks down when examined closely, especially on the financial question. That's the trap with narratives like this. They're built to feel true before they are proven true. They create the emotional experience of discovery, the thrill of, what if everyone has been lied to? And once someone feels that thrill, facts can start to feel like a letdown. But truth doesn't exist to entertain us. Truth exists whether it's cinematic or not. So what really happened to the Titanic? The evidence does not support a secret insurance plot. The evidence does not support a ship swap between Olympic and Titanic. And the official findings do not point to intentional sinking. Instead, the historical record points to an iceberg collision, flooding beyond the ship's design tolerance, insufficient lifeboat provision, warnings that were not handled with the seriousness they deserved, and a fatal chain of human and systemic failures. Senate report. That may sound less exciting than the conspiracy, but it should disturb you more, because a conspiracy suggests control. What Titanic reveals is something else, that prestige can fail, technology can fail, leadership can fail. And when those failures overlap in the dark, thousands of lives can depend on decisions made minutes too late. The myth says Titanic was sacrificed for money. The record says Titanic was lost through overconfidence, weak safeguards, and a world that was not as prepared as it believed. And maybe that truth is more haunting than any secret plot could ever be. Because if conspiracy was the answer, then at least someone